Welcome to This Prepared Life. I'm Allison, your host, and today I am so incredibly excited to have another guest episode for you. And we are welcoming Patrice Lewis, who is a blogger and author, and in my opinion, one of the founding inspirational women in prepping. So, welcome, Patrice.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am so glad to have you. Why don't you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself, your family, anything someone who might not know who you are would want to know.
Well, as you say, my name is Patrice Lewis. I've been married for 32 years. My wonderful husband, Don, is just my rock in life. We have two daughters. One is 27, one is 24. The older trained and became a certified nanny. She worked in New Jersey as a live-in nanny for 4 years, and then she came back to Idaho. Original idea was to come. She came back just before the holidays. She was going to spend Christmas with us and then look for work in Seattle. And that's just about when the pandemic lockdowns hit. And then Seattle just imploded, so that was totally out of the question. So she ended up moving out into her own apartment, getting a job in a nearby town, and then she recently moved back in with us, and she is taking over the woodcraft business that we've had for 30 years and making it her own. So that's kind of exciting to see this passed from father to son, father to daughter, so to speak. And then we have another daughter who's 24, and she is serving in the Navy, stationed out of Japan, deployed at the moment. So she actually re-upped and will be serving some shore duty for another few years. So we've got two wonderful kids that we're very proud of.
Can you share with us a little bit about where your prepping and or homesteading journey started?
It goes back quite a ways. We were married in 1990 and living in Sacramento. And it was actually a very, very bad traffic jam that just kind of catapulted us into reality, saying this is not the kind of life we want to lead. We just had this very deep-seated urge to move to the country and to raise any future children that we had in a rural atmosphere. So we left California. We just kind of up and left and abandoned two very well-paying jobs. We found out later that was a mistake. And we purchased a little fixer-upper on 4 acres in Southwest Oregon, just north of Medford. And that little place, we later called it our starter homestead. And we learned the rudiments of gardening and canning and keeping chickens. And we got cows, and we were milking and fencing and home repair. And this is where our daughters were born. I mean, we did everything in this little starter homestead. And then in 2003, we left Oregon for Idaho. And we ended up buying a 20-acre, again, a fixer-upper. And basically, then that's when we sort of moved full bore into homesteading. And we were just, on a mission to become as self-sufficient as possible. And that was kind of our goal for rural living. But before that, when we were still in Oregon, kind of meshing in with the whole homesteading interest was when Y2K hit. And our girls at the time were just, babies and toddlers. And it's funny, I remember a very defining moment. I had been wanting chickens. This is when we lived in Oregon, before, just when the kids were very young. I'd had chickens when I was a kid, and it's something I really wanted to get. And my husband, we were very, very, very strapped for cash, and I'll go more into that later. And so my husband was very much resistant. We had the startup woodcraft business. We were desperately trying to make ends meet, and chickens were just not on the equation. So one day I remember our second daughter was just a newborn, and I was lying on the bed nursing her. And my husband came in, and his voice was shaking. And he said, "What do we need to do to get chickens?" And I looked at him, I was just, what? Just completely out of the blue. And he said, "What do we need to do to get chickens?" And he tossed a magazine onto the bed where I was nursing our daughter. And the front of the magazine, it was Countryside magazine, had something called the Y2K countdown. And it was the first time I'd even heard of Y2K. This is probably 98. Mm-hmm. And he suddenly understood we were vulnerable. We had tiny babies. We had an infant, a newborn, and we had a toddler, and we were vulnerable. And it scared him. And so we went into full bore, holy cow, we got to do something. And we had an advantage. We were already rural. We had the 4 acres. So we put in a garden. We got cows. We got chickens. We put in fencing. We built a small barn. We just went crazy with what we could on an absolute poverty shoestring budget. And we did pretty well, all things considered. Now, of course, Y2K, because of a lot of background work that nobody was really aware of, came and went without much of an interruption in societal goods and services and all of that. But it did two things for us. One is it made us realize how vulnerable society can be to a takedown without doing anything that, things can happen. And the other is we really got addicted to this whole idea of homesteading. It was a thrill to be able to harvest our own milk and harvest our own fruits and vegetables and make cheese and can up fruits and vegetables from the garden and all this kind of stuff. And of course, the kids were getting involved as they got older. And it was a really addictive process as we got more and more into homesteading. So that's kind of how we became preppers. A lot of it was feeling that vulnerability when our kids were babies. But it was the fun of homesteading that kept us in it.
Can you talk a little bit more about prepping versus homesteading? I think if you ask 10 people, you'd get 10 different answers. But can you kind of maybe define those from your perspective?
There's a lot of difference, I think, between preparedness and self-sufficiency. Anybody can be prepared. You can live in a city apartment and have your food and water stashed away and your security implements in place and however you interpret this. But you can't be self-sufficient in an apartment or in an urban setting. So there is a difference. So the way we interpret it is we like the idea of self-reliance. We like the idea of being food self-sufficient. And because no one can ever go it alone. This lone wolf prepper is nothing but a myth. We also like the idea of having neighbors who are kind of like-minded. And both the last 2 or 3 situations where we've lived, we've been blessed with neighbors who are very much on the similar mindset. So to us, we like the idea of self-sufficiency, and that's kind of the direction we're taking it. Others feel differently, and they've got, bristling arsenal of firearms and this lone wolf mentality where they're holed up on a mountaintop and all that, and that's not us.
That is not us either. You touched on the concept of community, and that is something that I talk about a lot online with others. Can you share just a little bit about how you go about fostering community?
It's a dicey thing because, of course, preparedness is just intertwined to a really strong degree with OPSEC, operational security. So the whole idea is that nobody knows that you've got, beans and rice in the pantry kind of thing. So I've always said that preparedness is a 3-legged stool. So one side is what everybody focuses on, one leg, which is all the supplies, all the goodies, all the, the nifty gadgets and all this kind of stuff. So that's the one leg. But the second and the third legs are what people tend to pay less attention to. The second leg is community, and the third leg is skills and knowledge. So looking at this leg of community, by the way, a 3-legged stool, of course, is 3 points define a plane in geometry. So if you take away 1 point, the stool collapses. If you take away one leg, the stool is gone. So if you take away community, your support structure is gone. So that's just something to keep in mind. But yeah, it's a difficult thing, and it kind of depends on where you are. So one of the first things I would recommend is if you have an option of moving, to move to a place where people are more likely to be like-minded. So that starts getting into the politics of things. I don't want to go there, but it is just something to be aware of, to move to a place where your neighbors are likely to be a little bit more on the same page. And after that, it takes a while to get into things. Like our last location, we were there for 17 years, and we had lovely neighbors. We were blessed with just the best neighbors. And somehow we fell into having weekly potlucks that grew and grew and grew. And we had these potlucks going weekly for 12 years. And, it started with just our neighbors across the road from us. And then a third family came in, and then a fourth and a fifth and a sixth. And it just grew and grew. And it was a very fluid and dynamic group, and neighbors and friends and relatives and visitors. Everybody was always welcome. And we just kind of alternated who hosted. And we had that potluck going for 12 years until the pandemic interrupted it. And then we moved. But it was absolutely the most wonderful blessing I think I've ever had with neighbors. It was incredible. We got to know everyone so well, and we were all such good friends, and it made it easy if we needed help with something. Like I remember one time my husband was away, the girls were away too, and so a cow got out, a little bull calf got out, and I could not get that bull calf back where he was supposed to go because it was just me. And neighbors on all sides were gone. And so I started calling neighbors farther afield, and they said, yeah, you bet, we'll be right there. And they were there in 5 minutes, and we got this little bull calf rounded up and put back where he was supposed to go. And I remember thinking to myself, what a blessing these people are. So good neighbors and a strong community like that is just endless benefits. We were always there for each other. If somebody was sick or had surgery, we were there to cover their livestock help or bring them food or whatever needed to be done. We celebrated each other's milestones and we mourned each other's losses. It was just an amazing thing. So anyway, we up and moved for a variety of reasons I can go into later. And so here we are in a new location, and we're just getting to know our neighbors. We've been here not quite 2 years yet, about a year and a half. And so far, we have liked everyone we've met, and they all seem to be on the same page, but we don't have quite that bond of community yet. But if the bleep were to hit the fan, I really think we would. I really think we would have a lot of people getting together and saying, okay, the bleep has hit the fan. We need to all bind together because we're all kind of on the same page. And that was a little bit orchestrated on our part. We knew about where we wanted to go, where we were likely to meet people of like mind. And fortunately, we were correct. So we don't quite have that same strength as we had it in our last location, but then we were there for 17 years at our last place. So it makes a difference. Actually, we were there 18 years, now that I think of it. So anyway, but community, it's definitely, first of all, you're not going to have that same bond if you're with people who are of very, very different suasions. But get out and make an attempt to be friendly. Don't think you can be the lone wolf. That doesn't work.
I remember the first time I read your blog post where you talked about that three-legged stool. And I think I started reading your blog, I don't know, 4 or maybe 5 years ago. And I dug in like you would not believe. And I don't know how many weeks it took me, but I went through like every single one of your blog posts.
Oh,
like
wow.
If I had quiet
thousands.
reading time, yeah, you do. If I had some, 10 minutes of quiet reading time, I just kept the tab open on the place I left off and just kept hitting back. And that three-legged stool was just an amazing post. And I will link it in my show notes for others to find it because, it was just great.
Well, I should add that I did not make that up. I saw that online one time years ago, and it made absolute perfect sense. So I can't take credit for it, but I've certainly taken the idea and run with it because whoever came up with that was brilliant. It's a very apt description.
Yes. Do you have anything that you would share? I think there's a huge difference for people who are living rurally versus people who are in the city and building community and especially for women. I feel like our society has kind of closed women off from one another. And, when you think back years and years and years ago when grandmothers taught mothers and mothers taught daughters, and there was just this generational thing within womanhood that no longer exists. Do you have anything that you would share or just anything about that for women who are maybe not rural and struggling?
It's in urban areas or suburban areas, you're less likely to share a lot of similarities with your neighbors. You don't know who they are oftentimes. So it's not like, in a rural area where we go down the street and there's Bill with his track hoe and we call him up to do some, heavy jobs for us. That just doesn't really exist in an urban environment. So especially for women, this is where the internet has come in very, very handy. This is where you start connecting with locals who have similar interests. Like I've got a friend down in Sacramento, and she's very active in a church, and that's a huge source of friends for her. She also likes morning walks, and so she actually posted something about, okay, I live in this general vicinity, and I really like doing morning walks early in the morning before work starts. Is there anybody who'd like to join me? And darned if she didn't get 5 or 6 women walking every single freaking day, rain or shine, and they've become very good friends with her. So this is the kind of thing where reaching out to those with similar interests is a huge part of it. So either through church connections or through social media groups that have, there's social media groups for everything these days. That's the kind of thing that you probably want to work toward. And then you start getting to know people better. whether it's a knitting group or a walking group or a dance group, or I don't know, pick something, that you can start knowing them well enough to know, are these people that you can share hard times with? Who is trustworthy under difficult conditions? And some people are and some people aren't, and that's what you got to figure out. But yeah, I would say start by getting involved in your own hobbies, your own passions, your own interests. Even if these people that you meet up with are not next door, you can still develop community with others right there in your region, your city, or your suburb.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your move from Oregon to Idaho, and then again from one place in Idaho to another place in Idaho? I mean, moving a homestead is not an easy feat. And
Lord, no, it wasn't. Yeah, our move to Oregon, or from Oregon to Idaho, is interesting. My husband came home from an errand one time. Our girls were probably 3 and 5 at the time, and he said, "Hey, do you want to move?" And I'm like, "What?" He's very good at throwing these things out, just out of the blue. And apparently he'd gone into Medford, which is the biggest town of Southwest Oregon, to do some errands. And I guess he just hit too many traffic lights. He does not like traffic lights. He gets very impatient with them. And I said, "Yeah, the house that we lived in was 800 square feet, and we had 2 small kids, and we were planning on homeschooling, and we had a woodcraft business that spilled into the house all the time, and we had a small farm. It was a lot to cram into a little tiny house." So we thought, yeah, let's look around to move. And so we decided we liked Oregon, so we were going to stay there. The homeschooling laws were pretty decent. And so we started looking around Oregon. We must have looked for 2 or 3 years and really didn't find much that was within our price range and our bucket list of requirements. I remember there's this one house that we absolutely fell in love with. It's on 40 acres. It was a little pricier than we were comfortable with on a woodcrafter's income, but we made an offer, and we were outbid by $50,000 within about 15 minutes. And we thought, okay, well, that's the end of that. So I think that was probably the deciding factor in moving, looking further afield. So we decided to look into Washington, Idaho, and Montana. We weren't really familiar with those states. We'd never really been there, but what the heck, let's look around. And by this point, the internet was getting a little bit better. This is about 2001. And so we were able to look at some properties online, things like this. And what was the deciding factor for settling us in Idaho, believe it or not, was the homeschooling laws, because Idaho's homeschooling laws were very good in our opinion. So we focused on Idaho, and when the girls were 5 and 7, I came up and spent a week with some realtors in the North Idaho area, and we looked at dozens of properties, and I narrowed it down to about 2 or 3. And then I came home, and my husband followed up. I stayed home with the girls, and my husband followed up a couple weeks later, and he looked over the properties with a fine-tooth comb. He used to do home inspections, so he's very good at this, and narrowed it down to 2. And we decided on the one that we did, and we absolutely at first I was dismayed. It was one of those things where I'd only seen the house once for 10 minutes of looking through it. Mm-hmm. And when we first moved in, I looked around and said, what have we done? We left this beautiful little house that was built in 1874 in Oregon, and we moved to this piece of junk. And it grew on me and grew on me and grew on me, and we absolutely loved that place. 20 acres. We had room to spread out. We had room for a huge garden and for livestock and all the things that we'd been talking about. And then, like I said, the neighbors turned out to be just blessings. And so we were very happy there for 17 years, 18 years. And then the girls grew up and they moved out. And suddenly we're in this great big house all by ourselves. And we're going, this is just a little big for us. So we moved for 3 reasons. 1, we wanted to downsize. We did not need that big a house. And 2 is we wanted to buy a place for cash outright, so we did not have to have a mortgage. That was our second goal. And the 3rd is we were kind of up for a little adventure. I just hit 60, my husband just hit 65, and we thought we've got room in our lives for one more grand adventure. Let's go for it. And so, and then, of course, that coincided with the pandemic, and there was lots of drama involved with that. But we ended up buying a smaller house, much smaller house, on 8 acres. So we have to reconfigure our homesteading plans to a much smaller property. But we really like our new location, and the neighbors seem extremely nice, and we really like it here. We have no regrets about moving. So that's how we ended up moving to our new spot. That was a little over a year and a half ago. It was December of 2020 that we moved in.
I remember as your moving progressed and you were sharing on your blog about that feeling just like a kinship with you, because we moved at the exact same time you did. And my husband is
isn't it?
Yeah, my husband is self-employed, and so the process for us moving with COVID and all of the banking things that were changing just made it this incredibly long, drawn out process. And so we ended up not closing until December, even though we had made our offer. I think it was the beginning of July. It was,
oh, wow.
Yeah, it was. The realtor said this was the longest closing I have ever had in my entire career. So it was,
my goodness,
such a stressful process. I do not envy, anyone who is moving a homestead and all of the things that go along with it.
Well, if nothing else, it was an interesting time to decide, especially since our house is a great bit smaller than our last place, to decide what we need and what we don't need. So I guess it was a good weeding out process.
Yeah. I would love to hear a little bit more about what prepping specifically looks like for you. I mean, you shared that it started in Y2K, and just that feeling of vulnerability with young children. That's where it started. What has that progressed into, and how did that process happen?
Well, a lot of it was, as you say, that sense of vulnerability we had with the children being so young. And it just dovetailed so much into the homesteading interests that we had anyway. So this idea, this goal of saying, all right, could we be cut off? This was the question that we were asking ourselves. Could we be cut off from all services and still be able to live a comfortable lifestyle? So if we had no power, if we had no outside services, if we couldn't make it to the grocery store, could we still be okay? And those questions took a long time to answer, because no, we couldn't at the time. So that's where we started getting into the livestock, and I started learning how to, make cheese and butter and yogurt and all this kind of stuff, and caring for livestock. We had to learn how to dehorn and how to castrate and things like that. I learned how to butcher chickens. I've never liked butchering chickens. Now it never took off to the point where we were determined to conquer everything. For example, we thought about butchering our own steers, and we quickly realized this was a specialty job. So we ended up bringing in mobile butchers that do the deed for us. And so that's something that, you could call that a failure. We just never did learn how to butcher. But having watched them butcher, that's a big job, and you need some specialized equipment we didn't have. And we were trying to do everything on a shoestring budget. So anyway, the food self-sufficiency was our biggest motivator. We really wanted to be as food self-sufficient as possible. But that question, could we still live comfortably if services were cut off, especially electricity? That's still something we're answering, because we had to make a deliberate decision not to go off grid. And a lot of that decision was based on the fact that we have a woodcraft business. And so we needed sufficient power to run our power tools. And so we've never been off grid. And it's never something we've really entertained on a serious level, in part because the upfront costs are so high. What we decided to do instead is go low tech. So having hand-powered versions of everything we needed. So a hand pump for the well, should we need to transform to that. Hand lighting, i.e. kerosene lamps or battery-operated or solar-operated lamps. Things that were low tech versus, the high-tech fancy windmills or solar systems or anything like that. So we're trying to stay low tech in everything that we do, to have hand-powered versions of everything we do, and that's sort of the approach that we've taken. Others take different approaches. They like the solar systems and things of that nature. We just never had the funds for that, and so we've never gone into it. Another aspect too is it's important to handle whatever natural disasters are particular to anyone's region. So if our area, for example, is prone to wildfires. So we always try to keep bug-out bags packed, but you can't relocate a homestead if there's a fire bearing down. All you can do is flee. Others have, tornadoes or hurricanes or blizzards or earthquakes or, whatever natural disaster you can anticipate. It's important to have contingencies set up to handle those, whether it's fleeing, whether it's hunkering down, whatever the situation is. It's important to make sure that your family will be safe in that. So those are two things that I think every prepper should keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Those are great. Thank you. Looking back at your homesteading and your prepping journey, what would you do differently, if anything? Or what was like a very large learning experience for you?
It's interesting. When we first leaped out of the city back in '92, left Sacramento and moved to Southwest Oregon, we left behind these very two well-paying jobs. And we launched ourselves blind into rural living. I mean, we bought this little fixer-upper. It could literally have been called a shack. And I'm not exaggerating when I say we bought the 4 acres and they threw the house in for free because everyone expected us to knock it down. And it was a charming little house built in 1874. We wouldn't even dream of knocking it down. It was livable, mostly. And so we spent 10 years fixing it up, and we had to jack it up and pour a foundation and do all kinds of, really radical changes to it. But it was a beautiful little house. But anyway, we left these 2 well-paying jobs, and we were very confident that we could find well-paying jobs in Oregon. And that confidence, as it turned out, was very misplaced. I was back in school full-time. I was in grad school at that point. My husband had started the woodcraft business, and I was helping with that between studying and classes and everything like that. And we plunged, I kid you not, from 2 very well-paid salaries to 0 income. 0. I cannot emphasize how zero that zero was. It was quite startling. So at first, we had a little bit of savings that we brought with us. So we were living on that savings, and that didn't last long. And then we were living on student loans, and that didn't last long. And we were living on a very little income, a very sporadic income that we were earning as this woodcraft business got off its feet. And we were just scratching for money. It was absolutely desperate poverty. I can't even begin to describe that. And it lasted a period of time. But the unusual thing is 2 things happened. One is that it brought my husband and I closer together. Debt and poverty and things like that, money issues can drive some people apart, and it brought us together very, very tight. We were unified with this goal that no matter what happened, we were staying rural. We were not going back to the city. And that really brought us very close together. And the second is that we learned the art of frugality, and it really is an art form. And I became fascinated with it. And it's never left me. I've always been fascinated by the idea of how little can you live on? And so we flirted with that up and down. The downside, what you were saying is what would you do differently, is we went into debt just to survive. And we weren't buying anything frivolous, but the house needed some serious repairs. The roof leaked like a sieve, things like this. And sometimes we just used credit cards to buy groceries because we were very strapped for cash. And that debt lasted a long time. It took a long time to get out of it. And so as a result, at this point in my life, I have something approaching a pathological fear of debt. I just cannot say how battering it is, how emotionally battering it is. So that's probably what we would do differently. Don't leap into the unknown like we did. Make sure you've got some sort of source of income. But it all worked out. It gave us that powerful motivation to get our woodcraft business up and running, and that business supported us for decades. Helped us raise both our girls and kept us going. But we were always careful to live within our means, not to purchase a house with a mortgage that a woodcrafter's income couldn't cover. Things like that. We were very, very careful. But yeah, just avoiding debt. Oh man, just don't ever go there.
Yeah, we have a very similar, my husband is Joe, and we have a very similar story. It's like we were married very young, and he was in school when we had young children, and we weren't homesteading yet, but we were not smart with our funds, and we spent many years paying off the debt that we incurred while he was in school, just trying to survive. And yeah, paying cash now is like one of our biggest goals. Can we pay cash for that?
Yeah. Yeah, we do the same thing. We have, we transition to an all cash lifestyle, or as much as you can. Oh gosh, it's been 5 or 6 years now, and boy, we never look back. It's like, where has this been all our life? This is the smartest thing we ever did. So yeah, I forget we have a credit card. We do have a credit card, and sometimes if I'm out shopping and I run out of cash, I forget I have a credit card, which is actually a good thing. So yeah, we actually, all cash there's a lot to be said for an all cash lifestyle.
Definitely. I would love it if you would share just maybe some frugal tips, or I don't know if you have a couple that, are ones that you really implement on a regular basis, just, with the state of the economy right now, with inflation, with everything that is going on in our supply chains. Budget stuff is so high on people's radars, and people are changing how they shop and how they cook, and they're learning new skills. What are your top frugal tips for people?
Oh, I'm just sitting here racking my brains. Where do I start?
It's a whole podcast.
The first thing that came to mind, yeah, it is. It truly is. The first thing that came to mind is one of the first frugal things that we learned to do, or that I learned to do, was to hang laundry. I haven't used a dryer in decades. And back when we lived in Oregon, stopping using the dryer, this is when our girls were in diapers, literally cut our power bill in half.
Wow.
And that to me was the first eye-opening, how changes like that, a relatively small change, can make such a big difference. Now that's a dryer bill is less of a proportion of our electricity bill than it is, but whatever, it's complicated. So anyway, yeah, things like that. Look for ways you can cut daily expenses. Because we spent so many years being so frugal, we learned never to eat out and never to purchase prepackaged foods and meals and takeouts and delis and things like that. That's not even on our radar. So restaurant meals, not done. So learning to cook from scratch is enormously helpful in a frugal lifestyle. I'm not an enthusiastic cook. It's not one of those things I really enjoy doing, but you got to do what you got to do, especially when you've got little kids. And so learning, a 2 weeks worth of repertoire of meals that the whole family likes, and everybody will develop those kinds of recipes, and then just keep those ingredients in stock. Purchasing ingredients in bulk is very helpful. For example, my husband is a sandwich guy, and so he would just, this guy could eat sandwiches the rest of his life and nothing else, and he'd be happy as a clam. So I was making bread, and I went out to the thrift store and I got a bread machine, and that was one of the best purchases I've ever made. I probably make 3 to 4 loaves of bread a week just using this bread machine, and he's happy as a clam. Other things like a slow cooker, crock pot type thing, can be very, very helpful in scratch cooking. And then along those lines too, buying in bulk. For example, we pick up 50 pounds of flour at a time, since he does like his bread. And if you go to, say, restaurant supply stores or Costco or something of that nature, you can pick up 50-pound sacks of rice, beans, flour, whatever. So that's very helpful. And of course, being able to store it. Not everybody has room to store lots of things like that. But probably the single biggest thing that I could recommend, and this does take a while, so it's not something you can just transition to tomorrow. We, for financial reasons, for frugality reasons, we weaned ourselves off anything disposable and switched to washables and renewables. And that included everything from feminine hygiene up to paper towels to, you name it. We transitioned over, and it took a couple of years to kind of see what it was that we were doing, that the things that we threw away, and realizing, I think I read a statistic once that the average family spends $5,000 a year on disposable products.
Wow.
Like paper towels and paper plates and plastic cutlery and all this kind of stuff. And we were never quite that bad. But for example, we don't use Kleenex facial tissues. We use bandanas, and we have stacks of these things, and we use them constantly. The girls and I switched to washable feminine hygiene products. I'm sorry to get indelicate, but it's, we're all women audience here. And we never look back. It's like, where have you been all our life, kind of thing. It's marvelous how much money you save not having to spend money on monthly issues. We switched to just dish towels instead of paper towels. A roll of paper towels. I do have a roll. It lasts about a year. Actually, my last roll lasted almost 2 years. And we keep them for really nasty jobs like, dog vomit or spilled paint or whatever. What I do is at Costco, they have bales of what they call shop rags. Like they come, I think, 60 to a bale or something like that. And they're just white terry cloth shop rags. And that's what we use for kitchen towels. And we use them constantly. So things like this, if you can transition to reusable or washable products, it saves a tremendous amount of money, and it gives you a certain amount of peace of mind because you don't have to, in an emergency like that time of the month, run to the store in the middle of a blizzard to get some necessities. That's never an issue. You always have them. So that would probably be one of my biggest frugal tips. Some of the costs are higher up front. There's no question about it. But then those costs are amortized over the following months and years as you don't have to purchase replacements. So that is a hugely helpful frugal tip. I would recommend everybody start transitioning to washable products.
Those are great tips. Thank you. I get a question a lot online, and I'm not sure if you have an answer or even want to answer this one, but I'm going to throw it out there. So a lot of times women will send me a message and say, I want to prep for my family, but my husband thinks I'm crazy or my husband doesn't agree. And I am always very hesitant to weigh in on this one. So I feel a little bad that now I'm throwing it out at you, but do you have any suggestions? And you guys have been married for such a long time on starting prepping when a spouse doesn't agree.
A few thoughts come to mind. One is obviously it's a whole lot easier if you're unified because every couple brings separate strengths to a relationship. My husband has so many skills, it's scary. I mean, this guy can do carpentry, woodworking is his biggest skill, of course. But he can turn his hand to plumbing and to wiring and to construction and to, you name it, he can do it. It's just amazing. So he's very much the projects guy. My skills are in what he calls quartermastering. So when it comes to stocking the pantry, when it comes to food preservation, when it comes to animal husbandry, those are my skills. So we each bring separate skills to the table. So being able to unify toward a prepping goal is obviously an ideal situation, but it doesn't, as you say, it doesn't always happen. The first thing that comes to mind when answering that question is unless you've got serious other issues, you don't want to do something that is going to jeopardize your marital vows. Yes. So in other words, if you're so insistent on prepping that you end up getting divorced, is that an advantage? In other words, have you won anything? Now, obviously, a divorce may be necessary if there's other issues going on. But if prepping is the only issue in which you disagree, then you've taken vows to your spouse, your husband, and those really supersede everything else unless there's insurmountable other problems. So a lot of it depends on how hostile the other party is. If somebody is absolutely against it, well, then you need to find out why. Is it because you're on too tight of a budget? That's a legitimate concern. Is it because he thinks it's stupid? Is it because he doesn't think there's anything wrong that's going to happen, that could ever happen? Whatever. So it might be worthwhile addressing the concerns rather than jamming forward your own agenda, if that makes any sense. And again, it depends on how much you can talk to your spouse. I mean, some people have very good communication skills and say, okay, well, tell me what your fears or your concerns are. Let's work through them. Others say, I can't talk to my husband because he's just irrational. There's a lot of subtleties in there. But if for whatever reason your husband is not likely to get involved in this at all, then again, you can gauge how serious it is to say, can I just do it all myself? In which case, sky's the limit, have at. Other times it's, I'm picking up a new hobby, and this hobby is canning or dehydrating or whatever. You really can't object to a hobby, especially one that is so helpful for the family. In other words, see if you can just quietly pick up skills, pick up knowledge that will help you toward a goal, a preparedness goal. And it never hurts to have, extra things in the pantry and things like this. But it is important to figure out why the husband would not be on board. There might be some very strong issues. Like my mother, for example, grew up in extreme poverty. I mean, starvation poverty on the bayous of Louisiana. This is back in the 1930s during the Depression. As a result, she has an irrational fear. Now, my mom just turned 91, so she's getting up there in years. But she has this absolute fear of another depression with good reason. I mean, she witnessed the literal starvation that she had as a child as a result of this. So the thought, if I were to pitch to somebody with that kind of philosophy, the idea of preparedness, they would freak out. I actually kind of did one time to my mom, and she pretty much freaked out because, no, it'll never happen. It'll never happen again, kind of thing. Just absolute denial because of that fear that she had of starvation when she was a child. So that's a legitimate fear. That's a legitimate concern. And so that's the kind of thing where, if your spouse has a certain fear, concern, whatever, see if it can be addressed. But trying to bulldoze over the other person's feeling is only going to lead to marital discord, and you really need to ask yourself, is it worth it? Because you took vows with your spouse, and I'm of the belief that vows mean something, unless the other person has broken those vows through adultery or whatever. That's a whole different issue. But yeah, you need to ask yourself if your marriage itself will be jeopardized if you insist on your following through on your agenda of prepping. So I hope that's not too convoluted an answer, but
well, I think this question is a very hard one to answer because
it is a very hard one. Yeah.
Like I don't have a picture and you don't have a picture into someone else's marriage and their life. And
exactly.
There is no one right answer.
Yeah, there truly isn't. Every circumstance is different. I mean, if the other party, if the other spouse is just saying, I don't care, whatever, I'm not going to get involved and I'm not going to stop you, that's actually not a bad thing. Then you can set in motion what you think needs to be done. But if they're hostile to it, that's what you need to figure out. Why are they hostile? Don't run over their feelings. Don't run over, bulldoze over their emotions. That's not the right thing to do because that just makes them dig their heels in harder. You need to find out why. What's the issue? What's the baseline issue? With my mother, for example, I know what the issue was. She lived through the Depression, and they nearly starved to death. So that's not, something to trifle with or dismiss. So, see if you can get to the base of it and figure out why.
Yeah. And I love what you said about, learning skills, because that is a huge part of prepping, and learning canning or whatever food storage method is only going to benefit someone's family. So,
This is one of the things that I kind of object to people who focus on that one leg of the three-legged stool, which is supplies. You can't really buy yourself into preparedness. That's part of it, yes. I mean, it's nice to have extra supplies laid in and what have you. But that's why I don't really have a lot of patience with all what I call the whiz-bang high-tech stuff associated with preparedness, because you're trying to buy your way into preparedness, and it doesn't work. But being able to gracefully handle things that are thrown your way because you've thought them through and you've acquired the skills and the equipment, as like a pressure canner or whatever, to take care of things, I think is a better approach in the long term.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I call
in other words, everybody could buy garden seeds, for example, but if you don't have the skills to garden, you're going to be in trouble.
You had mentioned that your husband's skills and your skills just blend very nicely, and we call me the keeper of the food, because that is just kind of where all of my stuff lies and what I do with gardening and canning and preserving. And I enjoy it. So I think that's so important. I would love to do you have anything else that you're like, I really want to talk about this? This is an important topic. Or
I think a lot of it is for people who are just starting out on this path. I think one of the things I would recommend is not biting off more than you can chew, because the whole preparedness thing, just like the whole homesteading thing, can just be overwhelming. you have to do this and you have to do this and you have to do this and you'll die if you don't. And well, I mean, maybe, it depends if a wildfire is heading your way, but you know what I mean. But you get these people who are there to push an agenda, and if you start listening to too many of them, it becomes overwhelming, and then you lock up and you don't do anything.
Yeah.
So probably my for people who are just getting into this, it's to pick something and learn it. Pick a food preservation method, whether it's dehydrating or canning or freeze drying or what have you. Pick gardening or pick chickens or pick something, but just, something, and develop it, learn it, figure it out. And then when you're comfortable with it, pick something else and start, in that direction, because not everybody can have cows and chickens and whatever. If you live in the city, that's just not going to work, but nothing stops you from learning how to preserve food, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just so many things that you can learn. And so my thought was, don't get overwhelmed. Just pick something. Pick one thing. And often it can dovetail into an interest that you already have. Let's say you're an expert in the needle arts. I'm just making something up. Learn how to knit socks, or learn how to knit something that's going to be useful in a difficult situation. What are people going to be asking for, or demanding, or looking for if things get tough? Socks would be pretty important, that kind of thing. So if you have a skill, develop it toward with a preparedness goal in mind. If you've always wanted to learn a skill, now's your chance. I picked up canning. My husband and I had just gotten married. We were newlyweds, and I had built this little. We were renting a little crackerback house in a really bad part of town, and I started this little tiny postage stamp sized garden. It was probably 4 by 8 feet, and I had 6 corn plants and 2 tomato plants, I think. And I don't know what was going on with those tomatoes, but I ended up with more tomatoes than I knew what to do with. And I remember picking like 2 full grocery bags, paper grocery bags full of tomatoes, and bringing them into the kitchen and looking at them going, what do I do with these? And somewhere in the back of my mind, I'd heard about canning, but my mother never canned. I didn't know anybody who cans. This is long before the internet. What do I do with this? But it was just somewhere in the back of my mind. I'd heard of it. So I went to the library and I got some books on canning, and I canned these tomatoes. And I remember pulling them out of the water bath and putting them on a towel on the counter and looking at them. And I realized something very dangerous had happened. I was hooked. It was like, I was serious. It was like taking a drug. I looked at this and said, whoa, I think I'm in love. And I have always loved canning. It's like pulling jewels out of the canner when I'm done with tomatoes or carrots or whatever it is. And I taught myself how to can, and I never looked back. And that's a powerful prepping tool, as you can imagine. I ended up getting a pressure canner and acquiring jars and rings and lids and everything I needed. And it just became a hobby that just happened to be a very useful hobby. So it's one of those things where if you can take your hobbies and turn them into something very useful and preparedness related, it can be extremely helpful. But pick one thing at a time. Don't think that you have to do everything. That's we've seen so many people move to the country and then move back to the city because they try to do everything all at once, and it just doesn't work. You've got to be patient. You've got to be easy on yourself. And, pick something and get good at it. And then something else and get good at it.
I love that. I too love canning, and like the sound of the ping of the jar. It's just like,
yeah,
yes.
Yep. Oh, absolutely.
Is there anything else that you would want to share before we just kind of close for this morning? Anything I don't know enough about you to ask?
I think I would have to suggest people not be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, because it's the only way you can figure out how things go wrong. Because if you do fail, if you do make a mistake, something doesn't work, try it again in a different way. It's one of those things where a lot of people get frustrated if something doesn't go right the first time. And, gardening. I wasn't raised gardening. It was an uphill battle forever. It took us 9 years to realize that this is in our last place in that we moved, that we couldn't garden in the soil. The soil was just rock hard clay. It just didn't work. And it took us 9 flipping years to figure that out. And so we finally had to stop and say, okay, we are failing too much. And the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over and expect a different result. This isn't working. What else can we do? And that's how we developed a tire garden, gardening in tractor tires. And I did all the research, and the whole idea that tires will poison you is a myth. I got hold of the original researcher from which that originated, and he said, no, I was misquoted. It was a long story. So we started gardening in tires and went from 0 to 60 in, 1.5 miles, or however the saying goes. We went from almost nothing to almost complete food self-sufficiency with fruits and vegetables within 2 years by trying something different. We had to look outside the box and figure out what worked. So that's the kind of thing. Don't let failure discourage you. Just figure it out. Figure out what went wrong and why, and then address it. Sometimes you have to do really crazy things like look outside the box and garden in tires, which we did that because they were free, by the way. So that's the kind of thing. If your first batch of carrots from the pressure canner, every last jar failed to seal, then you have to figure out why. Don't just throw up your hands and say, I can't preserve. Figure out why. What'd you do wrong? And then try it again, and then try it again, and then try it again. So probably don't let failure discourage you. We have met people who just get so frustrated by failure that they're not perfect the first time that they throw up their hands in dismay and move back to the city or whatever they're going to do. Don't let failure discourage you. Just figure out what went wrong and do it again. No one's an expert just out of the gate.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like, I think over the last 20 years, we have had so many experiences, and we call them learning experiences, not failures.
They are seriously, yeah. They are seriously nothing but learning experiences. It's sad when sometimes, like we had this one situation, years ago, where we had a piece of sheet that we just had on the ground and we knew where it was, and it just was there. We were lazy, we didn't pick it up. And our big mistake is not picking it up because we had a cow that happened to jump the fence at that one spot. And so one day I go out and I see this cow standing on 3 legs on the wrong side of the fence. What's wrong with you? And I go up to the cow, and she had blood on her leg, the leg that was lifted up. Turned out she cut her Achilles tendon on that piece of sheet metal. I can't tell you how I felt, because I love animals. We raise them for meat, yes, but we care for our animals. And I felt like absolute trash. I should have picked up that sheet metal. I knew that's where she jumped, and I never did. And so we had to butcher her. And it's something I have never forgotten and never took for granted. I never, made that mistake again. But everybody makes mistakes, and I learned from it. It was a brutal mistake. It was a nasty mistake. And I hate seeing animals in pain. And that was something I should have known better. But anyway, it was a mistake. I learned from it. We never let sheet metal lie around again. So that's the kind of thing. Don't let it get you down. Sometimes you have to cry, sometimes you have to beat yourself up, but don't let it get you down. You learn from it.
Yes, absolutely. Why don't you tell us a little bit about where people can find you online? You are an author, you write books, you have a blog, you write a column over at WND every week. Tell us a little bit about all that.
I don't do social media. I've never felt comfortable doing social media, so don't look for me on Facebook or anything like that. I do have a website, which is just patricelewis.com. All that is kind of an oversight. It's not really very comprehensive, and I seldom make changes to it. My most active online presence is, as you say, my blog, and that is rural-revolution.com. Make sure there's a dash, because if you don't put the dash in there, it takes you to like a real estate company in Canada or something. So it's rural-revolution.com is my blog, and I blog there several times a week. And it's just a chit-chatty, this is how we live our life. We are actually, since we're still developing our new homestead here, I'll summarize projects as we go, but there's less day-to-day stuff on livestock because we don't have any at the moment, and I don't have a garden yet, and lots of things we have to do yet. But it's just kind of a chit-chat about our life, and that's probably the most active presence I have online.
All right. And would you like to share about your books?
Which one?
Any of them.
um, well, my first book was The Simplicity Primer, and I think it's out of print, so you might be able to find some used copies online. But recently, as in the last couple of years, I got picked up writing inspirational romance through Harlequin. So this is Amish inspirational romances are my latest thing, and I just got a 6-book contract, so I'm really doing a lot of writing on that. And those links can be found. They can be found on my website. I guess I had to put a permanent link on my blog. I'm really bad at marketing. um, so yeah, I should do that. Yes, what a concept, you know. And then on the blog also, I have a list of links to various magazines that I write for. Almost every rural-themed magazine that's out there. I just got an article accepted to Mother Earth News, and that's kind of an exciting thing. So, but I write for Backwoods Home and Self-Reliance. They're the same umbrella organization. I've been writing for them for years. Delightful people. And then Countryside and Goat Journal and Backyard Poultry and Backyard Beekeeping and all the Countryside umbrella event of magazines. And like I said, Mother Earth News just picked up my first article. So I do a lot of magazine articles, rural themed magazine articles. But yeah, the romance books are kind of my latest, and they're just a hoot to write. I really enjoy those.
Well, I'm not much of a romance reader. So I have to admit I have not read them, but I do enjoy like when you post the covers and the titles, and I'm always like, oh, that one sounds kind of interesting. So if I ever,
yeah, you know, it's funny. It's funny because it took a while to admit that I was writing these because most people associate romances with the 1980s bodice rippers. But these are Amish inspirational, which means they are absolute squeaky clean. Your grandmother could read them without blushing. In fact, my characters can't even use the bathroom, as I found out. The editorial standards are really, really strict.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, yeah, they're very clean.
Well, listeners, I will link Patrice's website and her blog in the show notes, so you can go there to find her. And thank you so much for being my guest on the podcast today, Patrice. It was just a blessing.
It was my pleasure. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. All right, listeners, thanks for listening.